This is a 2-hour meeting. It's going to go until 11 o'clock Eastern time. And there are 3 different parts to it. The first part, we will introduce the Rights Not Charity briefing. In the second part, we will have a series of panelists reflecting on the brief. And in the third part, we will open it for general debate. That will be about a 40-minute open forum, as long as we keep to time. The Special Rapporteur to the Right to Food, Michael Fakhri, sends his regrets. He could not be here today. But in his stead, we have a lovely facilitator in Smita Narula. Smita is the Pace University Elizabeth Hub School of Law's inaugural Hub Distinguished Chair of International Law and co-director of the law school's Global Center for Environmental Legal Studies. Professor Narula teaches international environmental law, international human rights law, environmental justice, human rights in the environment, and property. She is author of dozens of widely cited publications on human rights, food systems, and the environment, and has helped formulate policy, legal, and community-led responses to a range of social justice and ecological issues worldwide. In 2021, Professor Narula was inducted as a fellow into the American College of Environmental Lawyers. Prior to joining Hobb Law School, she was distinguished lecturer and interim director of the Human Rights Program at the Roosevelt House Public Policy Institute at Hunter College. Prior to Hunter, Professor Narula was an associate professor of clinical law at New York University School of Law, where she taught the International Human Rights Clinic and served as faculty director of the Center for Human Rights and Global Justice. In these capacities, she helped found and grow the law school's Human Rights Program, a top-ranked program for international law in the United States. In 2008, she was appointed legal advisor to the UN Special Rapporteur on the Right to Food, and served in this capacity for the duration of the rapporteur's 6-year mandate. From 1997 to 2003, Professor Narula served as India researcher and senior researcher for South Asia at Human Rights Watch. And in 2000, she co-founded the International Dalit Solidarity Network, a transnational advocacy network that helps advance the right to equality for 260 million people affected by caste-based discrimination worldwide. Professor Narula graduated with honors from Harvard Law School, where she was editor-in-chief of the Harvard Human Rights Journal. Prior to law school, she earned a BA and MA with honors from Brown University and worked on HIV and public health issues at UNICEF in the United Nations Development Fund. Welcome, Smita. It is an honor to have you here. You have the floor.
Thank you so much, Josh. I see you didn't get the abbreviated bio I put in the chat function. No need to take up time with my bio when there's so many other important matters to discuss. I'm humbled and delighted to be here. And I want to, first of all, just really thank you for organizing this important event and for launching this extremely important and insightful brief on a human rights perspective on corporate food aid. In the time that I have today, I wanted to help frame our conversation and situate the release of today's brief in its ecological, socioeconomic, and legal context. As you are all well aware, we are living in a time of deep crisis. Ecologically, humanity is facing the triple threat of climate change, pollution, and biodiversity loss. And socioeconomically, we are witnessing and experiencing widening inequality and the deep consolidation of corporate power. Together, these crises and conditions are undermining the human rights of vast swaths of the global population, both in the global south and in wealthy but unequal countries. These crises also have a lot to do with how we produce our food and how we address food insecurity. As I don't need to tell any of you, our industrial food system is a system that generates hunger and malnutrition, impoverishes farmers, displaces rural communities and indigenous peoples, and wreaks havoc on the environment. The industrial food system is also rapidly degrading the natural resource base on which food production depends. These food systems are also characterized by a deep imbalance of power in that a handful of agribusiness actors and other corporate giants exert immense control over and reap tremendous profit from the production, processing, and retailing of our food, while on the other hand, small-scale farmers and producers form the majority of the world's food insecure. In wealthy but unequal countries, food insecurity rates are also alarmingly high among fast food workers and retail workers and among migrant laborers. The COVID-19 pandemic laid bare the extreme and deep fragility of these systems. So it stands to reason that we're not going to fix our environmental problems or socioeconomic inequalities and food insecurity without fundamentally transforming our food systems and without transforming how we ensure access to food. There are many pathways to achieving these goals, and legally speaking, a lot has happened over the past decade and beyond to elevate alternatives to our industrial food system and to elevate an alternative to the charitable model of food access. To begin, there's increasing clarity that around the fact and acceptance around the fact that the right to food is not merely the right to food assistance in times of food emergency, but it's a right to a political, food, and economic system where people can provide for themselves with dignity and with rights, including through a living wage and through secure access to land, water, feeds, and other resources. In 2018, and following years of mobilization by La Via Campesina and its allies, the General Assembly adopted the UN Declaration on the Rights of Peasants, which enshrined for the first time in international law peasants' rights to land, water, seeds, and to food sovereignty, among other rights, food sovereignty for all, indeed. And in 2022, the General Assembly recognized the right to a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment. And the relationship between food systems and environmental degradation finally started to take center stage at global environmental summits. But at the same time as these promising legal developments are taking place, a legal and narrative architecture is also being put into place that one normalizes a permanent state of food emergency, that two continues to prop up our industrial food systems and the waste that they generate, and that continues to deny individuals and communities their fundamental agency and dignity and rights in how they produce and access food. In the wake of the steep rise in food insecurity during COVID, and as is thoughtfully described in the brief being released today, corporate-backed charitable food aid has been advanced globally as a win-win solution to resolving problems of surplus food, food waste, and food insecurity on a global scale. This food banking model, which is now being exported to 76 countries across the globe, aims to position corporate charity as a global strategy to feed the impoverished by repurposing waste from industrial food processes. This expansion of the global food banking model to countries in the global South threatens to undermine recent food sovereignty gains by normalizing and even recasting corporate food giants as charitable actors and providing justification of ongoing overproduction of food and food commodities. Against this backdrop, our hope for today's conversation is that we begin to develop a shared analysis that understands that the struggle of the food oppressed in wealthy but unequal countries is the same as the struggle of peasants and other rural community members in the global South. It is a shared struggle against the corporate capture of our food systems and of international policymaking spaces. It is a shared struggle against the narrative capture of what is needed to ensure human rights, including the right to food. And it's a shared struggle because this global food banking model essentially has this insidious effect of reducing states' human rights obligations on the right to food, to providing food, and that to food waste in times of emergency, rather than insisting on the robust and holistic understanding of the right to food, which is to ensure that food is accessible, available, adequate, and sustainably produced, and ensuring that, including through implementing effective income-based social protection and economic and sectoral policies that help realize the right to food and other human rights, and rather than insisting that states ensure food sovereignty, including through access to land, water, seeds, and other natural resources. I think it's extremely fair to say that we are at a crossroads, and that the path that we choose will determine the future of all human and non-human life on the planet. I'll conclude by saying that I think it's fair to say that we are at a crossroads, and that the path that we choose, including in terms of how we produce our food and how we ensure food access, will help determine the future of all human and non-human life on the planet. But we do have an alternative path to take. As La Via Campesina has stated, the alternative exists. Small farmers and social movements from all over the world promote a model based on food sovereignty and orientated towards peasant-based agriculture and artisanal fisheries, prioritizing local markets and sustainable production methods. This model is based on the right to food and on the right of peoples to define their own agricultural policies. In the depths of the COVID crisis, we also saw the rise of mutual aid and solidarity economies and other community-based grassroots initiatives that pushed back against the normalizing of crisis and against the corporate capture of the solutions to that crisis. We saw that here in the United States, where I sit, and we saw it all over the world. But for these powerful, loving, humane, ecologically sound alternatives to take ground and really take root and gain ground, we need to squarely address the corporate capture of our food system in all of its manifestations. Today's brief helps make clear that taking on the corporate-backed charitable food aid model is part of that struggle, and that it is a shared struggle towards our mutual vision of ensuring the right to food and food sovereignty for all. I'm delighted once again to be present with you and to learn from you today. And I'm deeply, deeply grateful for the work of so many that are participating and whose work has long inspired me to help advance a world with more dignity, more sovereignty, and rights. Thank you.
Our co-authors, Allison and Kaylee, are now going to present to us.
I am coordinating the National Right to Food Community of Practice and also a member of the Global Solidarity Alliance for Food, Health, and Social Justice. And I'm pleased to be here today to present this briefing paper. The COVID-19 pandemic laid bare some fundamental problems with the global industrial food system, from long feeding lines snaking around city blocks to the breakdown of agricultural supply chains and urban migrants lacking transportation to return home or land to grow their own food. These phenomena were visible to all. The precarity of millions with insufficient incomes and a lack of social protections was made especially apparent through rising rates of food insecurity. We witnessed various responses to these converging crises. Most visible were charitable feeding operations appealing for public and private sector benevolence to secure additional food and funding. Existing emergency food aid organizations were strengthened and new ones created. Regional food banks and their network of local food charities prevented untold suffering for many families, some of whom were experiencing unemployment and food insecurity for the first time. A second and significant response came from governments that provided cash benefits and lifted millions above the poverty threshold. Unfortunately, many of these were short-term interventions, even as the economic effects of the COVID-19 crisis, further exacerbated by the war in Ukraine, rampant inflation, and climate change, continue to increase poverty and inequality across the world. There was also a third response that is important to reflect on, one rooted in mutual aid and solidarity mechanisms that have long shaped community food provisioning strategies. This took on many different forms, from community refrigerators on street corners stocked by neighbors to large-scale social movements mobilizing their advocacy structures to respond quickly and directly within their own communities. For instance, Movimiento dos Trabajadores Rurais Sem Terra, MST, or the Landless Workers Movement in Brazil, marshaled more than 170 community health clinics, thousands of rural schools serving as temporary hospitals, and dozens of MST food processing facilities throughout Brazil to produce food for families impacted by the pandemic. Farmers networked across the country grew, harvested, and processed food, distributing it monthly to their own communities, as well as to families living in urban areas. More than 250,000 vulnerable households throughout Brazil were supported with farm fresh food. Kaylee, are you back?
I'm back. Can you hear me?
Right. Yes.
Brilliant. Thanks so much, Alison.
Yeah.
Yeah, so amidst these varied responses to what was a sudden and steep rise in global hunger, corporate-backed food charity dominated the stage and continues to wield outsized influence in hunger relief efforts across the world. Without a robust counter-movement and narrative shift, this will further entrench emergency food aid into a troubling state of permanence. So what are the problems with corporate-backed charitable food aid? We're witnessing the rise of a permanent state of food emergency around the world, and one that is being addressed through the false promise of solidarity through corporatized food charity. So initially framed as a temporary response to address an acute need, born out of the rollback of social protection programs in wealthy but unequal countries of the global north, corporate-backed charitable food aid, and in particular the North American food banking model, is perceived to be an attractive win-win solution to resolving problems of surplus food, food waste, and food insecurity on a global scale.
This dominant food banking paradigm, modeled on Feeding America and promoted via actors such as the Global Food Banking Network, or GFN, has now been exported to 76 countries, including low and middle income states on every continent. Funded by some of the most powerful food corporations in the world, the Global Food Banking Network's new strategic plan is focused on expanding, quote unquote, expanding the presence and influence of food banks all over the world. An expansion that aims to further anchor corporate charity as a global strategy to feed the poor by repurposing waste from industrial food processes. Nearly half a century after the first food bank opened its doors in the US has failed to solve its hunger problem, while the food banking model proliferates in the US, across Europe, and is exported to countries around the world. The reliance on emergency sources has become chronic. The public perception that hunger can be solved with improved food access, especially by capturing food waste, serves to absolve the government of responsibility. It serves to provide greenwashing for a corporate food regime that is supported by federal policies to overproduce, and ensures the role of other systemic root causes of hunger, such as low wages, corporate control of farming, and the legacy of racial oppression. By simply defining the problem as hunger, the approaches to ameliorate it have been largely limited to access, capturing and distributing corporate food waste, and protecting government nutrition assistance programs. Charitable food distribution has become normalized.
And the growth of corporate food waste as hunger relief and the ongoing institutionalization of charitable food aid undermines UN member states' obligations under international law to respect, protect, and fulfill the human right to adequate food through coherent and comprehensive policies and programs. Such failures create opportunities for the corporate capture of public nutrition policy by framing food banking as a win-win solution to hunger relief, distorting the very concept of solidarity. In its place emerges a hunger industrial complex, whereby private food companies benefit from the very existence of emergency food infrastructure via lower tax burdens, savings on waste disposal costs, price protections, and the halo effect of corporate social responsibility marketing.
Our chief concern is not with the oft uncompensated care and solidarity that frontline emergency food aid workers are driven to provide. Charitable food aid workers are concerned with meeting needs in their communities. They are not motivated by the expansion of corporate power, increased control over the food system and its profits. Indeed, many emergency food volunteers are themselves in situations of economic precarity. By working to recover surplus food as hunger relief, however, those working in food banks and their local network of partners have become instruments of a corporate food regime that promises to resolve two intractable problems born out of the profit-driven food system: unsustainable overproduction and endemic hunger. Instead of addressing the root causes of poverty and advocating for policies that would check income inequality, greed, unfair labor conditions, and unsustainable agricultural practices, these corporate partners lobby national governments and infiltrate international policymaking spaces as stakeholders, promoting the false link between food waste and food security, and reinvesting very little in the communities they purport to serve. It's essential that those on the front lines of these networks come together to collectively build strategies that address these problems in international fora, in our own country's governments, and within our own local communities.
International law requires that states respect, protect, and fulfill the right to adequate food at all times, using the maximum of their available resources for its progressive realization. The obligation to fulfill includes policies and programs to facilitate access to land and natural resources, such as agrarian reforms, decent income through social protection, and to provide direct humanitarian assistance in situations of emergencies, including through international cooperation. From a human rights perspective, humanitarian food assistance is an important temporary tool for governments to meet their obligations, particularly in times of crisis, always aiming to re-establish affected communities' ability to nourish themselves. However, across the global north and increasingly elsewhere, food banking and its public-private institutional arrangements have grown into a highly problematic permanent response to food access failure, a fixed state of emergency that benefits the profit motives of the private food sector.
The United States Department of Agriculture, for example, provides food to vulnerable households under the Emergency Food Assistance Program, or TFAP. For over 40 years, these public funds have largely benefited entrenched U.S. agro-food interests, mitigating risk for large agricultural producers and food manufacturers rather than prioritizing the needs of low-income households. Further, the corporate sector leverages the food banking capacity subsidized by the TFAP program to offload retail and manufacturing food waste into food banking networks. This practice lacks accountability, transparency, or democracy with regards to the types of foods provided and the costs associated with revaluing corporate food waste by a largely underpaid or voluntary workforce. Across Europe, the Fund for European Aid to the Most Deprived feeds a similar supplementary role in local initiatives to provide food aid and basic material assistance across the continent. Over 3.8 billion euros was earmarked for this fund for the 2014 to 2020 period. Tax laws are increasingly shaped to accommodate and incentivize food corporations to donate their excess, further eroding state obligations to fulfill the right to food and reproducing a food system that requires a permanent state of food emergency to effectively function.
And so what does the human rights perspective mean in this context? Human rights are an essential tool to overcome all forms of intersecting discriminations, social exclusion, exploitation, or marginalization. In particular, a right to food analysis of food access failure must focus on the structural causes and the systemic drivers of their acute and enduring economic, social, and political vulnerabilities. When people in a wealthy country go hungry, it's because of discrimination. When people in highly unequal societies do not have access to the resources to adequately feed themselves, it is because of social exclusion. When people cannot afford healthy food due to inadequate salaries, it is because of exploitation. This is why a human rights approach is essential. The fact that hunger and malnutrition mostly affect people living in poverty and rarely elites points to food insecurity as a manifestation of extreme inequality and marginalization, both within countries and among them. Revaluing food waste cannot be an adequate solution to these deep-seated and structural problems.
The growing demand for humanitarian responses to food insecurity through the food banking economy indicates that state policies and institutions are systematically neglecting their obligations to respect, protect, and fulfill the human right to adequate food. The most insidious feature of the corporate-based charitable food aid model is the joining up of two very different issues: surplus food and hunger. Food banks have become partners with, even dependent upon, the very corporations that benefit financially from overproduction, as well as from abysmally low government-protected minimum wage policies and grossly inadequate Social Security benefits. Instead of addressing the root causes of poverty and advocating for policies that would check corporate greed, the narrative that the hungry will always be with us and charity is the only solution is increasingly normalized. Highly visible charitable food endeavors reinforce the idea that people in need are sufferers, not citizens, recipients, not rights bearers. The growth of institutionalized charity contributes to this process and undermines the work of securing the right to food and its attendant bundle of human rights.
We need strategies and policies for true solutions. Corporations and governments are promoting and codifying a false link between food security and food waste. Together, they have ignored and exacerbated deeper structural problems associated with overproduction and food waste, created new financial incentives to uphold dysfunctional industrial models of food production, and captured charity as another vehicle to consolidate corporate control of the food system. This interdependence between public and private charitable food provisioning is a failed response to ensure food security for all, with its entrenchment undermining the state's obligations to fulfill the human right to adequate food, and it must be challenged. Solutions consistent with human rights require public policies that address and overcome structural food access barriers that people face. Food and nutrition policies should be designed to overcome the need for emergency food by ensuring that food is consistently adequate, available, accessible, and sustainable. If surplus food redistribution infrastructures are required to meet this goal, these should be destigmatized, universally accessible, connected to regional food provisioning systems, and governed by local community development interests and goals, and not those of distant corporate actors.
Most importantly, states must develop and implement effective income-based social protection, economic, and sectoral policies and programs that realize the right to food, along with other intersecting rights to health, social protection, housing, living wages, and education. Public policies must also include effective regulation of corporate food monopolies to hold them accountable, ensuring that businesses fully comply with labor standards, including the provision of living wages, formal employment contracts, and allow for independent trade unions. Lawmakers must also end the practice of tax evasion and loopholes. Finally, public food policies must also meaningfully invest in community-based food systems that can sustainably and equitably nourish everyone, regardless of their income or social status. Only then will all people begin to realize their economic, social, and cultural rights and be enabled to feed themselves and their families in dignity.
So there is an urgent need to expose false solutions to hunger and poverty as rates of household food insecurity continue to increase across the world following the pandemic and geopolitical and climate shocks. We have many examples of mutual aid and solidarity mechanisms that are effective and dignified ways of ensuring that people have access to food, housing, healthcare, and land. Yet such initiatives remain under-resourced and marginalised in public policy fora. Whilst these and other civil society formations engage with the state to challenge unchecked power of corporate interests and denounce public policies that violate human rights, they are also building people-centered collective responses and counter-narratives that model alternative public policies rooted in social justice, including income-based solutions. Social movements for food sovereignty are prefiguring a world that is shaped by bottom-up organising, by restorative justice, agroecology, and regional food and farm systems. We encourage these movements to consider this collective call to action now. Rights, not charity. Thank you.
Thank you, Alison and Kaylee, for summarizing this brief for us. But I want to pass the floor back to Smita for a response, if you would.
So thank you so much, Alison and Kaylee, for that very thoughtful overview and presentation. And as you will all see from the brief itself, I think it captures the problem and the both systemically and also how it undermines the advancement of human rights in this incredibly important field. My response to the presentation, I'm going to put in three categories. One is this category of building our own narrative and developing that shared analysis. The second being legal tools and responses. And the third being how do we center, Kaylee, what you described as the people-centered collective policies and responses. So first, in the realm of narrative, it really struck me in your presentation that as we are thinking about and describing, Allison, you described this exporting of a model. And this, of course, isn't the first time that an American-based model around food has been exported to the vast detriment of communities across the world, including, and something very close to home for me, I'm from India, the export of the Green Revolution model to India from US-based scientists, which admittedly did lift a lot of people out of food insecurity and resulting and food shortages that were being faced, but that came at a tremendous socioeconomic and environmental cost that the country and its farmers are continuing to reel from today. That Green Revolution model is also now being aggressively exported across the African continent as well. Another exporting that comes to mind, or relationship that comes to mind, is the relationship between the US's dumping of cheap subsidized foods in countries in the global south that drove out small scale farmers, both under NAFTA and other trade agreements, and the imbalance of equal playing rules in trade policies, as well as the dumping of surplus food as charitable aid to food insecure communities in other countries that has long been a practice cast as charity, but with deep, insidious and undermining effects. So narratively, I think, especially as we try to knit these struggles together, sharing why the exporting of models from the country in which I sit has proven very costly for rights and for the environment and for communities, and might be helpful. In the realm of law, I was very struck, Kaylee, about how you said this charitable model also deeply absolves governments of their responsibilities, right? So there's a complete removing of the government as an actor from these processes. And that's part of what we're concerned about with corporate capture, generally speaking. You're pushing the state aside or allowing state policies to be dictated by corporate actors at a time when deep intervention and thoughtful community-led and rights-based intervention is needed by the state. The focus on tax laws was also very profound to me because it's an area where I think all of us could pay much more attention. And many folks on this meeting and call already do pay a lot of attention, I think, to tax policies and how they serve to either advance or undermine socioeconomic inequalities and human rights. But especially in this context, it's worth thinking through how basic tax as well as other legal structures are serving to prop up a particular model, and how those very models could also be intervened with to prop up the other. And then finally, on this question of sort of community organizing, I'm deeply struck by the framing of the brief, which really points out what comes out of crisis. And there are many different responses that come out of crisis. And the briefing describes three of those responses, one of which, and we're seeing this in other sectors and communities as well, is to really entrench the status quo, and to do it in a very insisting way, to do it using authoritarian tactics as well, and to really continue to prop up the vested interest and the status quo. And then another model, as you've defined and showed, is this model that's emerging of collective community-led responses rooted in solidarity and people struggles and movements that really reclaims the solutions, knowledge, expertise, and policies for communities by themselves to advance solutions that have the potential to actually be effective and long-lasting. I'm struck by the Brazil example that's in the brief in particular, and think that there can be, and there's so many other models that are represented by individuals who are on this call as well, helping to elevate those alternatives so that we're not only critiquing and dismantling the system that is undermining human rights and the environment, but we are also simultaneously building up the alternatives that we want to see, I think is a big part of the process, and something to which many on this call are also contributing. I will leave it there so we can also hear from others. And my thanks finally for this important contribution and for inviting me to take part.
Thank you so much, Smita. It's lovely to have you. We are now going to move to the panel portion, and I'd like to give the floor to Emily, who will give a brief overview of this section of our call.
Hi, good morning, good afternoon to everyone. Excuse me. I'm Emily Mathiasen, and I work with FIAN International, which is an international right to food and nutrition organization. And very happy to be part of this group working to develop these ideas with everyone else here. So on this part of the call, we wanted to hear, we heard a little bit more around the framing, and now we want to hear more experiences from how people from different parts of the world and also different areas of work are confronting these issues in their daily work. So each contributor will have about 7 minutes, and I will try to do some gentle timekeeping if you get to be over that time, just to have, just in respect of everyone who's here, to give enough time at the end for all of you to also contribute to our discussion, because the idea is to not just have a one-way giving of information, but also to have some sharing of information. So to kick us off, we're going to start with Graham Riches, who is a long-time advocate of the right to food and a critical, has critical engagement with food banking issues for a long time, who wrote the book Food Bank Nations, but he'll do a better job at introducing himself. So Graham, I'm just gonna send it over to you. You have 7 minutes.
Yeah, hello, and thank you, Emily, and thank you to Alison, Kaylee, and to Smita. I mean, I really don't have anything to sort of add in relationship to that. I should just say, to introduce myself to people who may be unfamiliar with my work, as I've been writing about these issues since the early 1980s, published the first book in Canada, actually, on food banks and the welfare crisis way back then, and actually with Janet Poppendick, I mean, we've written together sort of over the years, with other books coming out, and Food Bank Nations in 2018. I'm long since retired, and talking to you from Vancouver Island, and sort of really wondering what I can add to this discussion. And I think what I want to do is just add a challenge to us, because I think we're good at talking to each other and agreeing with each other generally about the issues of corporate, food charity and the problems that it raises. And I think my question is, where are the journalists? And when I talk about where are the journalists, I'm talking about mainstream journalists. I think I'm talking about the people who sort of comment in the press in these issues, but not in the alternative media, but in places like The Guardian, places like the New York Times, etc., and so forth. And the reason I want to do that, and I can give you a couple of examples actually, in both here in Canada, in the last, just on September the 26th, there was a very interesting piece published by the CBC, the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, and it was entitled "Pandemic Floods 12 Big Food Banks with $168 million." This is a kind of leftover money that they actually gathered from the pandemic, when there was a lot of, as we know, sort of financial support sort of being poured into it. But this money is now in their reserves, and it's really quadrupled their reserve balances since 2019. So food banks are in a very, and corporate food aid is in a very, in the Canadian context, sort of secure situation, sort of going ahead, looking ahead, even though food insecurity pressures have risen. And at the same time, we have a link here with Food Banks Canada, because the Canadian Broadcasting Company actually way back to 1985 has been supporting and promoting food banks. So we have this kind of media, this sort of mainstream media link up with corporate food aid. And Food Banks Canada has sort of recently produced its annual report. It always comes out about this time of the year when they're looking, I mean, to be fair to them, that they're sort of looking at provincial and territorial food poverty reduction plans, but actually they're still at the same time sort of promoting their own brand of aid. And that article came out on September the 26th, and then lo and behold, on September the 30th, there was an article in the US version of edition of The Guardian, and it was called "The Hidden Cost of a Shutdown: America's Battle with Food Insecurity," written by Rita Omoka, who's a Nigerian-American journalist. She was unfamiliar to me before. It's actually a very good article. It's very informative about what's going on. But the people that her sources are Feeding America, Father's Heart Ministries, and City Harvest New York. And I think, and really talking about, the problems with the Farm Bill, etc. The point that I want to make is that when I read this in the mainstream media, and particularly in progressive mainstream journalism, I think there's a big gap here. And the problem is that none of these articles or reports mention human rights. They don't talk about the right to food. They don't talk about social justice. They don't talk about any of the issues that we've actually been talking about so far. There's no mention in them of respect, protect, fulfill. There's no mention in them of the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights and the right to food. There's no mention in them of governments as duty bearers. There's no mention of them and their international obligations. There's no mention in them of food insecure people as being rights holders. Rather, actually, the Food Banks Canada talks about government-supported recipients, or we talk about guests. We don't talk about people who are hungry as being citizens. I mean, actually, I think even talking about people as citizens is a problem, because actually people are people, whether they're citizens of a country or not. And so I think it's about sort of basic human needs and fundamental human rights, which we're all familiar with. There's also no mention in this reporting of the FAO and the Right to Food guidelines. I mean, we may have a critique of that, but where it actually spells out very clearly the role of the state, the role of the private sector, the role of civil society, and what ratification means. There's no mention in the US media of the fact that the United States has never ratified the right to food. And so we're really seeing the export of corporate food aid from the one society that has never ratified this convention. And I think that's deeply problematic, because we need the US to show leadership in that area. And also, I think this, I'm just concluding here, that with the notion that we talk about the global north and the global south, but I think we've got the global south in the global north. I mean, we have it here in the Canadian context very clearly, in the context of Aboriginal populations, and also in northern Canada with Inuit populations, with devastating food insecurity and a whole range of other issues. And of course, in the global south, we've also got the global north, pursuing its path, which I think has been sort of expertly set out in where we, well, in the form by the former speakers. So my question is, and this is the challenge to us, I think, is where are the journalists in the mainstream media who are going to report what we are talking about? Because I think we might talk about lack of political will and politicians not being on board, but I think we have to have the New York Times, we have to have the Guardian, we have to have the press in different countries around the world actually talking about what we're talking about and reporting what we are saying and what we are doing. Maybe I'm out of line, maybe that is going on in other countries that I'm not familiar with, but I suspect not. Anyway, that's my I hope I didn't go too far over 7 minutes. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Graham. You were like at 7 minutes exactly, and it's amazing. And thank you so much for your exactly. Thank you so much for your really important perspective. I think also on pushing us collectively to think about how we change the narrative, because controlling the narrative is one part of pushing for change. And unfortunately, as you said, the funds and capital behind the corporate narrative are very powerful, not only in food banking, but in all elements related to the industrial food system. So it's a really important point for us to consider as we're discussing moving forward. So next, we're going to pass it to Dee Woods. Dee is coming from the UK member of La Via Campesina, the Land Workers Alliance, as well as the Independent Food Aid Network. She is a woman of many hats, which I'm sure she can explain to you better than I can. So Dee, I'm going to pass it to you.
Thank you, Emily, and thank you for having me here. So the Independent Food Aid Network, IFAN, are members of the GSA and the Global Network on the Right to Food. So our work has always been grounded in those principles. And I think my work has always been about connecting the principles of food sovereignty with the right to food. So really love the paper, and it's a really good analysis, but I think I'm coming with a view from the margins and a view from below. And we need a new social compact. Effectively, our governments are not working first, our policymakers are not working first, they are working for the corporations. In academic circles, we hear this talk about power asymmetries, and understanding that some people hold more power in terms of resources, in terms of money, food, everything. So how do we change that? How do we disrupt that? How do we dismantle that? And that is the work that community organizers and social movements like La Via Campesina and the Land Workers Alliance have been doing. It is to disrupt and to dismantle and to provide solutions grounded and co-created with people who are most impacted by hunger, by poverty, by all these social issues, social and economic issues that we have. It is about building a new democracy. And the first UN Special Rapporteur on Right to Food says democracy is never powerless. So as social movements of hundreds of millions of people, we know we hold power. We know that when we're in the UN spaces, and particularly the Committee on World Food Security, as part of the civil society and indigenous peoples mechanism, that we have a voice, that we are proactively contributing to some of that change in terms of policies. But it can't just be at international level or global level. We have to do that at national level. We need to do that at local level. And to some degree, food policy councils do that, but then they're not really effective, right? And people who are excluded, people who are exploited, people going hungry are still not participating in those conversations, in that research, in that co-creation at local and national level. And we're also not getting that solidarity. We speak And I think people need to understand what solidarity really means. It is about that commitment of care for each other as human beings. Instead, what we have is this fragmentation of social movements and communities, those in poverty, those in housing, those in land, those in, food and farming, gender, you name it, but they all intersect. They all intersect in terms of how power impacts all of us. So we need to start building a new social compact that starts from the ground, a new social compact where we grow in solidarity, working under food sovereignty umbrella, because those human rights, it isn't just about the right to food, it is about all human rights, because they're indivisible and they're interdependent, right? So we need to be coming together as social movements under the banner of food sovereignty, to work together in challenging, disrupting, dismantling, abolishing this travesty of sort of global power on our lives, on our dignity. Because if we don't, then why are we fighting? Why are we building the so-called alternatives? We can only achieve so much on ground. Yes, we have solutions, but without that policy environment, right, that policy enabling environment, without the finance flowing to the spaces and places where it is needed most, right, we will not achieve anything. So I would say we need to be building real solutions of hope. Yeah, we need to be coming together in our social movements and working towards not ending hunger, because hunger is the symptom, right? We need to end these inequalities and uproot and dismantle these inequities, these systems of oppression, extraction, and exploitation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dee. I think you put very strongly the urgency and importance of building an intersectional movement. And I'm really, really thankful for that. Thank you. So next we're going to move to Josh, who we already heard from a little bit at the beginning. And Josh will be sharing some reflections from the Global Food Banking Networks meeting in Mexico, which really puts the eye on the corporate capture of food charity. So Josh, over to you.
Thank you, Emily. Double checking that you can see my screen here. Okay, so I am calling in from West Virginia, which is one of the poorest states in the US and has very, very high endemic rates of food insecurity. I wrote a dissertation on community-based responses to hunger through the charitable food complex, starting at the local level, and then entering into the everyday practices of the regional food bank. We have 2 regional food banks here in the state that are members of the Feeding America consortium. They also receive federal government food, and food banks are very complex organizations with many different motivations driving their work and many different pressures. And so a part of my dissertation was really trying to jump scale and understand where are these pressures coming from as local volunteers and actors work to resolve hunger. What is going on in the broader governance system? And so this took me to looking at Feeding America. And after my dissertation, realizing that this model was being exported across the world, really wanting to dig into the work of the Global Food Banking Network. I attended their meeting in Mexico City this March as an event ethnography to try and understand what the mood was, what the main discourse was. And so this is a quick report back on that meeting. Overall, we might understand this meeting, the overall mood was just a celebration of food banking, of the benevolence of this model, of how good it makes everybody in the room feel, right? And there were people coming from all over the world, descending on Mexico City, being wined and dined literally with some of the best fare at the Sheraton Hotel. And to me, there was so much contradiction in this space, right? You had food bank directors that are working to connect food to vulnerable communities, themselves meeting in a space that is so disconnected from the communities that they're actually serving. Now, they were all paid to be there in that their flights were paid. The Global Food Banking Network is often a grant maker and sponsor of their work. And if you are invited to a free trip to Mexico City, of course you will come. But we need to realize when we're thinking about these power differentials that Dee was talking about is this is a very, very well-funded organization. They have a staff of about 40 people, and they support a network of 70 food banks and their networks of agencies all across the world. Those of you that study food systems may recognize some of the names on here, land grabbers and union busters, and not the best cast of characters to usher in a liberatory food future for us. So in summary, there were 350 participants at this meeting from 50 different countries. The focus of the discussion was not about hunger. And this was somewhat shocking to me because at least many of the meetings that I had been to previously in my research were still putting hunger front and center. But this meeting did not discuss hunger, its root causes, or anything like that. It was all about sustainability and climate goals, food banks as a disaster response, and food banks as key nodes in global food supply chains. So they now play this very important role in overall food supply infrastructures. This was also a regional networking event where South American food banks would gather, African continent food banks, Southeast Asian food banks to share strategies and best practices based on their particular contexts. The keynote speaker was Dr. Bram Govaerts, who's the Director General of the International Maize and Wheat Improvement Center, or CIMMYT. This is the genesis organization of the Green Revolution, okay, of genetically modified seeds. And here's his full quote, which I won't read, but really he was comparing some of the early failures of crop experimentation with this problem of surplus. And we have created too much food, but we couldn't actually use the food that we were creating. So we had to tweak those genes. And he was challenging food banks, saying, you are the next iteration of this phase. It was a rehearsal of what you represent here today, which is the need for international collaboration. He also spoke about food banks as essential infrastructure to sustain the global food system in the context of heightened climate and political shocks in the 21st century. Now, this is important because they're framing food banks as a key part of global food supply chain insurance mechanisms. And we need to be attuned to this framing because, first of all, food banks cannot fulfill this role. And secondly, it props up a food system that is producing a lot of these problems in the first place. Big data was also in the room, tech-driven solutions to create more efficiencies along food banking supply chains. And there was a whole morning of discussions about food policy and how local food banking organizations can influence food policy in their countries. Doug O'Brien here is one of the key architects of the US Good Samaritan Act, which was passed in 1996. That act absolves food corporations of any responsibility for their donated product and offers tax incentives to them to do so. There is a broader encouragement of trying to shape laws in specific countries to facilitate the transfer of food waste, similar to the Good Samaritan Act. We also heard about market-based solutions to resolving food waste and hunger through carbon credits. The Mexico Food Bank secured $107,000 by demonstrating that by feeding food waste to hungry people, they were resolving the climate crisis. Now, this is another perversion of this discursive framework that Graham asked us to pay attention to. I'm going to go through quickly here. We had, testimonies about the impact of food banks, a lot of focus on disaster politics in the way that food banks are a response to 21st century in which we expect more and more disasters. So with that said, this really reinforced to me the need for a broad counter narrative, one that is resourced adequately to counter some of this power. And I want to invite all of you here to attend our meetings for the Global Solidarity Alliance, the Rights Not Charity meetings. These take place on the first Thursday of the month at 11 a.m. Eastern Time or 5 p.m. Central European Time, and we'll send this information out as a follow-up as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Josh, and thank you so much for the work you've done and sort of getting behind what's going on with the Global Food Banking Network. I think it shows a lot around the false narrative that's being constructed around food banking and charity that we've been discussing today. So thank you for that. And let's see, we're going to move next to a different part of the world. Sefu Sanni is going to be sharing with you from the World March of Women in Kenya. So Sefu.
Thank you so much. I hope you can hear me. All right, so I've listened to the presentations, Rights Not Charity, also to the panelists who have come before me. And I couldn't agree more to what has been presented here today. And especially now, because we've spoken of the global north, and maybe we can speak a bit also from the global south, but also the globe as a whole. And I think the intersectionality of food security and human rights could not come at a more important time. We have seen the repetition of the situation of the food crisis in 2007, 2008, because of the increasing investment in food and agriculture, where we have aid givers and investors who are leading the way in public policies and are not people from the ground up, where 10% of the budget of every country should go to agriculture or to budget the sector that employs most people and obtains food security. But this is not the case. So one thing that is very important is for us to have the advocacy from the ground up. And this was spoken earlier by Dee. When we have the advocacy from the community level, and then the national level, and then the international level, and especially when it comes to the right to food, because, and especially for indigenous communities, and I will speak about Africa, have been feeding themselves from a long time, even before this crisis. Why? Because of the use of agroecology and indigenous seeds. And this is being taken over by industrial agriculture for profit. That is why in Africa, one of the things that we are facing is the dependency on food import when we have the ability to be able to feed ourselves. And of course, this is the corporate capture that we are talking of the food systems that we have, and especially when we're speaking about food as charity. Earlier on, we were referring to people, and even people are usually referred to as, quote unquote, recipients. And as we said, food is a human right, and it's not for profit, and it's not charity. And even as we look at the SDGs, we see that the first SDG is on no poverty, and the second one is on zero hunger. So hunger and malnutrition, of course, manifests amongst people who are living in poverty. And this is mainly because of the inequalities. We've seen that when in the rights and not charity. So it's a manifestation of extreme inequality and marginalization. How are we able to sort this? We need to address the root causes of poverty. And of course, this manifests itself when it comes to hunger and food insecurity. And we need to advocate for policies, to check this corporate greed. And these policies need to be from the ground up. I will also speak about the issues of the youth, inclusion of youth in food and agricultural systems, and especially youth and women as well. When we speak about the intersectionality of food security and human rights, one of the things that this corporate culture takes away, and especially from the young people, is for them to be able to work and produce in agriculture and food systems. In Africa, where I come from, women actually till the land and produce 80% of women produce the food that is consumed in Africa. But you will find that these women have no access to land, and even the food that they produce, if there is any surplus, they will not be able to get any economic benefits from it, because this will have to go to the men because of cultural constraints. So these are things that we also need to look at. And when we bring about the human rights approach, then we are able to tackle the issues of gender inequality that arise. We are able to tackle the issues of young people. Also, when we speak about young people, there's a lot of rural to urban migration for people to look for white-collar jobs. Why? Because agriculture has been taken over by people who are practicing it for industrial value and profit. So they will buy land at such a high price, for example, in the rural areas where the young people are not able to afford. So access to land and natural resources, especially for young people who actually have the power and the muscle to be able to work on the land and to provide, is very important when we're speaking about the ending of the corporate culture of food. When it comes to policies as well, and especially in international fora, we find these same people who are actually practicing the corporate culture of food are the people who dominate in the international fora. So it is very important that we ensure that even at the international level, where very important decisions are made, that we allow or we find ways to bring the people who are on the ground, the people whose voice matter, the people who are suffering most from poverty, from hunger, from inequality, for us to be able to find solutions. And something I have said before in other fora is there cannot be change for us without us. We need to be part of the change. We cannot have other people who are speaking for us and making policies for us or giving advocacy. We should be the people who are on the table to speak about the solutions that need to be given when it comes to the food crisis. And even as I finish, I think I will also emphasize on the issue of indigenous knowledge and agroecology as part of the solutions to the food crisis and even the climate crisis that we are undergoing, because the climate crisis that we are undergoing is also brought about by the use of the GMOs and the practicing methods of agriculture that are not really good for the soils. And I think I will end it there. And just one last thing, when Josh was speaking about the international collaboration of food banks, I think it's high time that we also have an international collaboration for food as a human right. So ICFHR, and we can have as many social movements in it, as many grassroots movements, as many women and youth movements, as many farmer movements, as many NGOs that are actually against the corporate culture of food systems. In this way, then we are able to fight this internationally, and we are able to fight it together. Thank you so much, and over to you.
Thank you so much, Sefu, for sharing your perspective and also underlying again how important it is to think intersectionally and internationally and sort of beyond our own house sometimes, and how we're building up power to fight corporate capture and to change the food system. So last but not least, we're going to hear from Marthin Hadiwinata, who is part of FIAN Indonesia, but also the National Coordinator of Ekologi Maritim Indonesia. I hope I pronounced that right, Marthin. And over to you.
Hi, Emily, and hi, everybody. It's a good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Here in Indonesia, it's 9 p.m., but I will try to share a similar situation, but a bit different, but important. Hopefully, it will be important and give good inputs on the discussion of the corporate capture on food aid. This issue, I mean, the report that was written is very important. I mean, in Indonesia, it's not really happening. Maybe we're not really conscious if that there already, but in our terms, we have met several situations where corporate capture happening in Indonesia. As we are going to enter political years in Indonesia, we clearly see there is collusion, between the executive and corporate in what we call the oligarch of the corporate capture in Indonesia, where the business entrepreneur, the billionaire are part of the political party and the ruling government right now in Indonesia. And on our important note, we as FIAN Indonesia already done some kind of research with what we call it's not a state charity. We do a survey on the food assistance in the COVID-19 pandemic in Jakarta, because Jakarta is the capital of Indonesia and really hard impacted by the COVID-19. So based on our finding, there are 4 kinds of social assistance to address impact of COVID-19. First of all is president social assistance. It's like 9 basic food staples that was provided to poor family in Indonesia. The value was around 38 US dollar per family, and all of the 9 food staple were like rice, cooking oil, canned sardines, beef cornet, instant tea, sweet soy sauce, spicy sauce, and instant noodle, and also milk and souring soap. All of them are based on corporates. The second social assistance is non-cash food assistance. It's a similar food assistance. It's very small and relatively not going to provide food for the entire month, but it was basically around similar situation where only $7 around to value of the social assistance. The third one is the direct cash transfer, valuing around 300,000 rupiah per family per month, and it's around 19 US dollars. So it's not really meets the needs of the poor family in response to address the COVID-19. And as we all know that there is 4 basic norm of right to food and nutrition about the availability, accessibility, adequacy, and sustainability. It was none of them are fulfilled by the social assistance from the government at the time. Many are the data is not valid. Many the recipient of the social assistance was not in validated data. The second about the adequacy is like Indonesia had basic needs of the social basic right to food and nutrition basic standard. But when we see all the social assistance is not meets the standard of the food quality, and also the physical accessibility, that there is it was a very bottom not a bottom up process, but it was like raining from the sky, but it was not spread to all the poor family that needs food, something like that. And also the sustainability. It's only happen when the government have money about that, so that it doesn't fulfill the 4 basic right to food norms. And one of the the bad situation, the worst situation happened was that there is a corruption case happened. The Minister of Social Minister Juliari Batubara, coming from the PDIP, the ruling or the majority political party, are convicted a corruption case of 32 billion rupiah, or 2 million US dollar. It was sentenced to 12 years plus a fine of 31,000 USD. And one of the important issue is that there is corruption from bribery, from around 58 corporate that company that provide food for those social assistance. And it was a very worse situation that happened at the time, and government are not having a good paradigm on the how to respect, protect and fulfill the rights of the people, the basic rights. And as we all know, Indonesia is archipelago country. I also read some research on the small scale fisher that the fisher actually have a advantage that in terms of in the small island, they were protected from the outer from the foreign people or from people that coming to the island, and they can stop the spreading of the virus. But then the issue was the fish that they would catch, the capture of the fish was not distributed or absorbed by the local market, because the local market are closed because of the pandemic. And the government doesn't do anything about that. I mean, like such as the declining price of the fisher are not being answered by the government. So what I want to say that it is a similar situation that the previous friends has already discussed about the food aid. And I also see that there is a global food banks also happening in Indonesia. It's same situation. It's really similar flows of they are taking food from the big corporate that operate in Indonesia and share it to they said the needs, yeah, the people that needs the food. But the situation is that I'm also linked to the report that VN Indonesia written before that first of all is the data are invalid. Yeah, many data from the government are invalid. The second is the intransparency of the social assistance, which many government are explain where the relief will be distributed. The third is the government still think this is a charity, as the title was the title of the relief was social assistance from the president. You know, because of the president, wanted to have more hegemonic to the people. So it was called the social assistance from the government, from the president. Yeah, not saying the government, but mention the president. And the last one is, as what I mentioned, that there is a state corporation, yeah, state capture of corporate corruption, yeah, that capture of corruption that happened in the social assistance. I think that's all my inputs for today's discussion. Thank you very much. I give floor back to the Emily.
Thank you so much, Martin, for sharing your perspective. And I think it's really great to have a totally different context where we see how all of these issues are manifesting and how these questions of charity and the morality of charity and also government accountability are just as important, in how these questions of food banking and charity are so intertwined in a much bigger context and machine of problems, for lack of better ways to put it. So thank you so much. So now that we're going to move into the next part of our discussion, or the last part where we can hear from all of you. We have so many people here with so many different experiences and knowledge and things to share. We would encourage you to ask questions, share your experiences, whatever you feel today. Just maybe before we get started, two things. The first is I want everyone to make sure that their interpretation is on the appropriate language, especially thus far we've had all English speakers, so maybe you haven't done that yet, so that if someone speaks in French or Spanish, you can hear right away. So on the bottom, there's sort of a globe, and just to make sure you've chosen English or whatever language you want, but I know that's probably mostly an English problem. The second is if everyone can keep their inputs short so that we can hear from as many people as possible. Again, feel free to share, you know, whatever, just a thought or experience or anything on your mind, but also feel free to ask a question either about the brief that was presented or to anybody who shared today, or to each other as you're sharing as well. So it should be a conversation. So with that, we can open things up. Oh, sorry, you can also share in the chat if you'd like, but of course we'd rather hear your voices while we're here together. So I might see, trying to monitor using the hand raising function if you can, or you can also indicate in the chat if you are not as technologically savvy as I am. Maybe as people are thinking about what they want to say, I see in the chat there's been a lot of discussions about the Global Network for the Right to Food and Nutrition. So maybe I can just quickly give a 1-minute explanation. So the Global Network for the Right to Food and Nutrition is a global alliance of NGOs, social movements, etc., working on at the intersection of different movements for the right to food and nutrition. I did put the website, and if you're interested, you can contact hasn't been as active as in the past, but I think now there's a clear call for reactivation. So it'd be really great for anybody to join, or if you want information, can contact the organizers and we can for sure share more and invite you into those spaces. So let's see. Okay, we have some hands now. Isa, let's start with you and then we'll go to Ahmed.
Sí, hola, yo voy a hablar en castellano, por si alguien no tiene la interpretación. Bueno, buenos días, buenas tardes. Y bueno, qué bueno la presentación. Y bueno, primero gracias por el informe y por todas las presentaciones. Creo que bueno, nos dan un panorama, ¿no? de la situación que tenemos. Y bueno, yo simplemente quería aportar como dos puntos que me parece que, bueno, en alguna de las intervenciones han pasado un poco por encima y me parecía como interesante, ¿no? Un poco desde la visión también europea. Yo, o sea, vivo en el País Vasco, en el Estado español, y estamos en estados que supuestamente tienen una asistencia social, ¿no? Y quería aportar simplemente dos cuestiones, ¿no? Que nosotras vemos en esto del Banco de Alimentos. Por una parte, y como estamos hablando de derechos, no me parece menor el tema de que, además de todo lo que habéis comentado del modelo de Banco de Alimentos, y antes comentaba Graham el tema de los mensajes que se dan y las narrativas que rodean a todo esto, me parece también importante en esas narrativas señalar, o por lo menos aquí lo vivimos, el tema de la propia, voy a decir, criminalización de la gente pobre cuando no admite, bueno, esta comida, vamos a llamarle comida, que se le da a través de estos bancos de alimentos, ¿no? Y cómo incluso los canales de sostén social y de asistencia social muchas veces están condicionados a que aceptes determinadas ayudas alimentarias, ¿no? O sea, si tú quieres recibir ayuda social, tienes que estar dispuesta a recibir este pack, ¿no? de comida, ¿no? O sea, va dentro del pack de asistencia social, ¿no? Es interesante cómo instituciones que son incapaces de entender la indivisibilidad de derechos son tan capaces de entenderla para saltárselos todos juntos, ¿no? O sea, es como bastante interesante. Entonces, también se dan unas narrativas de es que en realidad no lo necesitan, es que no saben comer. Luego está el tema de que la gente pobre es obesa porque no sabe comer y hay que educar a la gente pobre en cómo alimentarse, ¿no? O sea, el foco se pone siempre en las personas más vulnerables, ¿no? En lugar de en el sistema, como habéis estado repitiendo. Y luego otra cosa breve, perdón que no me quiero extender, es el tema de, antes creo que ha sido Josh, ha sacado el tema de los datos, ¿no? Y del tema de la digitalización. Aquí estamos viendo cómo la digitalización de la ayuda alimentaria, todo el tema de las tarjetas, con la disculpa de no generar estigmas, lo que están generando es un control brutal de cómo se alimentan las personas pobres, ¿no? Y cuáles son sus hábitos de vida y alimentarios, ¿no? Y nadie está teniendo ningún tipo de control de esos datos y de esa digitalización de esas vidas, ¿no? Entonces, bueno, simplemente quería como aportar estos elementos porque se han comentado en alguna de las intervenciones, pero me parece que, bueno, al menos aquí, a lo mejor en otros sitios no tienen demasiado sentido, pero aquí ahora mismo está como bastante centrado. Y por último decir que cuando hablamos de la captura corporativa, claro, cuando salen los logos y las marcas que han salido en esos paneles, como que a algunas nos queda bastante claro, pero ¿qué pasa cuando, como pasa en el Estado español, el intermediario y el agente clave para la privatización de todos estos canales es la Cruz Roja? Porque claro, ahí estamos utilizando elementos no tan corporativos para de alguna manera privatizar, ¿no? Las vidas, que es lo que estamos viendo que nos está sucediendo aquí. Nada más, gracias.
Thank you so much, Isa. Thank you. So next we're going to go to Ahmed.
Thank you, Emily. Thank you, Emily. Thank you, everyone. This is really great opportunity again to interact with all of you from within the space of our network, global network for right to food and nutrition. I think Palestine and Gaza is the right place to talk and reflect on the control food, control people policies, and the suffering from the instability within the local food system. Yes, I think highlighting the rights is always very important issue. And we used to suffer in our country, not only in our country, but in so many other different countries in the global south, the suffering from the food aid dependency. Food aid dependency is really affecting negatively and directly hundreds of thousands of people and families in different parts of the world. It also has a very bad implications on the local food system and the stability of the local food system in different countries and communities. So the question is how the local community to what extent our civil society organizations as well as the local communities are able to confront the such conditions and situations that are affecting negatively and directly their lives and the food system in the different countries. From our experience in Gaza urban and peri-urban agriculture platform, we have managed along the past few years to help the urban family farmers, notably the women, to come up with their own space and forum, community-led forums to struggle for their rights, to highlight their rights and to concentrate on their rights, the rights of the local farmers in the production, in marketing. It was not easy, but we are still in the heart of this struggle to protect our rights when it comes to the food. And we used to highlight an important issue that Gaza or Palestine needs more than food assistance. Needs more than humanitarian assistance. It's about rights. And we will not be able to work and highlight our rights or defend our rights without understanding the existing power dynamics. That's very important. It is not easy to build our rights advocacy and policy influencing strategies without depending on a realistic and community-led process for understanding the power dynamics and to see how to create our entry points to make change happen, but this time not by us, by the local community. Thank you so much, dears.
Thank you, Ahmed, for sharing your perspective. And maybe just to tell everyone, we're taking some notes and trying to capture all of this as well so that it's not being lost, everything you're sharing. So next we're going to go to Arturo. Go ahead.
Hola, ¿me pueden escuchar?
Yes.
Ok. Nosotros en México estamos viviendo una transición hacia nuevas políticas públicas y en este caso no es algo que se haya visto tanto como estas políticas públicas que buscan la transición agroecológica y por ser algo un tanto novedoso en América Latina, se debe de estudiar la relación entre la diversidad y los derechos humanos, porque la diversidad como recursos genéticos son patrimonio de la humanidad. Y ahí es donde venimos a que las políticas públicas a veces van por la ganancia política del discurso. Y podemos llegar a omitir errores y al ser una política pública, no se autocorrige para no perder popularidad, no acepta sus errores. Entonces, como decían los compañeros, las comunidades son las vulnerables, se les considera a los pobres. Y ahorita estas políticas públicas de transición agroecológica les están dando dinero en efectivo a esas comunidades. Entonces, ellos tampoco quieren, ahora sí que perder ese pequeño apoyo que nunca habían tenido. Entonces, no hay autocrítica tanto del mismo gobierno como de los mismos pobladores de las comunidades. Y hemos detectado errores muy básicos, errores muy básicos de no analizar los mismos estudios del mismo gobierno de años anteriores en cuanto a diversidad. Y son políticas públicas que no se autocorrigen, errores muy básicos que si en verdad buscaran el beneficio de las personas, pues se autocorregirían esos errores, se aceptarían esos errores básicos. Estoy hablando de un error básico de congruencia de diversidad, porque estamos hablando de diversidad y proteger la diversidad, y uno de los abonos que se recomiendan es la lombricomposta. Entonces, el gobierno no entiende que no es lo mismo que tú en tu ciudad, en tu departamento, hagas tu lombricomposta en tu invernadero para tu propio consumo, a que tengas 20,000 centros de lombricomposta que estén liberando especies invasivas de lombriz a todos los ecosistemas simultáneamente. Entonces, ese es un ejemplo nada más. Y regresando a la digitalización, ellos, pues todo ese apoyo pues se da mediante las tarjetas y unas alianzas con ciertos bancos que son conocidos en las comunidades. Y los técnicos o la gente que opera esos programas, de cierta manera, está digitalizando datos. ¿Por qué? Porque pues ellos también quieren mantener su trabajo. Y esa sería mi participación, a ver si podemos hacer una forma más internacional de, de proponerle a los gobiernos que hay cosas que se pueden retroalimentar ellos mismos para ir mejorando la política y no ir protegiendo sus intereses políticos. Sería todo. Muchas gracias.
Oh, thank you so much, Arturo. So next we have Annie Bellows. Thanks. Oh, you need to unmute yourself. We see you, but don't hear you. There you go.
Hi, thank you so much, everyone. I've taken a huge amount away from everyone. I find this thread related to corporate capture that goes from what Joshua talked about in terms of the conference to Marthin in terms of talking about corruption, exposed corruption. And I would be curious whether the speakers might want to talk a little more about the possibility of tying those threads together in a way to expose actual legal conflicts, for example, creating monopolies, and using the ability to pull together those threads to push or change the discourse in manners that Graham referred to as necessary. Thank you. Oh, and I would love it if some of those conversations that we heard, if there's anything written so far, please share it with all of us. I know there'd be a lot of interest. Thank you.
Thank you, Annie. Maybe when we send out the briefing and other things, we can share some additional resources, because I think there's a lot of other things this group has written as well. So next on the list is Bill Jeffrey. Go ahead.
Hi, I thought this was a very interesting session. It's the first time that I think that I've seen a session that was squarely addressed to this issue. But I wonder. I mean, my assumption is that corporations donate to food banks only to the extent that they can secure some kind of public relations benefit from it, or to silence their critics. Or their potential critics. This happens with school food programs too. But I wonder what can be achieved with existing laws about misleading representations or tax laws to ensure that companies aren't overstating their contribution to the problem or misstating it. And so I'm eager to hear what others have to say about that.
Great, thanks, Bill. And if anybody wants to address Bill's comment, please raise your hand and we'll put you on the speakers list. Sorry, Juan Carlos, you wanted to speak next?
I think he dropped from the call.
Oh, pity. Okay, well, we just have a few more minutes. But Josh, if you want to give a feedback to Bill.
Yes, thank you, Bill. I think what we need to remain attuned to within food banking supply chains is that they really facilitate the enclosure of corporate food waste into a particular delivery system that benefits those organizations. So by transferring obsolete inventories from a retail space into charitable gifts, there are legal mechanisms that are revaluing that waste. And I think we need to be asking ourselves, who actually owns the waste? Who owns the surplus? And the food banking economy has created mechanisms by which corporations that overproduce food continue to hold ownership of that food until it is distributed as charity and extract value from it. Why is it that low-income folks that are having trouble accessing food at the supermarket are not able to just pull the excess from there at the end of the day? Why does it have to go into this massive redistribution channel that does not really promote the dignity of the human person? So I wrote about that enclosure in the Agriculture and Human Values in an article that tries to explain the mechanisms by which corporations extract value from the waste. I hope that was a helpful answer.
Thanks, Josh. Let's see, I think we have time for one more comment if somebody wants to share. Otherwise, Hala, go ahead. And then we'll close.
Yes, thank you. And thank you so much. This is extremely interesting, a lot of information and perspectives. I've just been reminded of an experience I tried to do in Cairo with the refugees, working with women refugees who are learning at a center for embroidery, and where we offer them a meal a day. And we were looking to get access to the food bank and also these other entities that claim to be using the food waste. And after months of negotiations, we arrived at nothing, zero. As Joshua was explaining, there's no way the real people who need this food have access to the food waste. It goes into a very long cycle whereby it comes back to benefit these organizations or entities. And then another thought that came to my mind was, of course, that food banks, especially local food banks, are not a bad idea. It's just a good idea that went bad and has been co-opted. I'm not talking about a lot of the food aid, which is, of course, another level of co-option. But even the local food banks, which serve, and Emily knows because she was living also in Egypt, it serves a purpose, a need, but have gone really bad, have been co-opted, have been taken to a different level, have been involved, becoming more and more involved with the corporate food production cycles. So it's another example of how the co-option of good ideas happen, and we need to be very vigilant to that and find ways to go around it. And also it creates this charity societies, which is quite a problem. I live in a charity society in Egypt, whereby the government is now relying on people's charity to solve the problems that the government should be solving. It's social protection, is mainly relying on the charity with people, and also sometimes under religious pretext, which is even more serious. So the creation of a charity society, the co-option of the good ideas, and also the impossibility of the delivering food to those who need it and deserve it. So these are three thoughts that came to my mind. Thank you so much for all of this, and we continue. Thank you.
Thank you, Hala. And yeah, thanks to everyone so much for sharing all of your experiences and your perspectives. It's also really exciting to hear so many different perspectives from different parts of the world. And I think that's been a tremendous advancement in this work and on these topics, is hearing from so many different parts of the world. So really looking forward to continuing that discussion. We have to wrap up soon, so I will hand it over to Josh to do that and to give us some indications of how we can move forward together. Thank you.
Thank you, Emily. One point I also want to make is that we are countering 400 years of plantation-based agriculture. One of the interventions in Mexico City was from the director of the Guatemala Food Bank, who was talking about a problem that she was facing with trying to educate low-income folks on how to eat snow peas, because it was not a part of their diet. But Guatemala produces about 80% of the snow peas consumed in the United States. And so these plantation economies that are imposed in certain places then create excess that form the basis of what is supposed to be now a nutritious meal for low-income folks there. So this is highly problematic and needs to be called out. And it's going to take a very long time as well to shift this narrative.